This is the introductory education programme for supporters of FRFI. Its structure serves its purpose by establishing the need for organisation in order to meet the crisis of capitalism and fight for socialism. We also examine a number of important issues for revolutionaries: Marxist critique of political economy, imperialism, the labour aristocracy, the national question, anti-racism, the oppression of women under capitalism, and environmental crisis. Finally, we look at the fight for socialism today, as led by the Cuban Revolution, with the need for progressives in Britain to take up an explicitly anti-imperialist standpoint on all these issues. This programme is in no way fixed and is open to suggestions. It remains therefore a work in progress. It is being discussed in open forums across the country where FRFI supporters are active. In section 1 we ask, why the RCG? The Revolutionary Communist Group is a Marxist and Leninist organisation which is committed to building a revolutionary socialist movement in Britain. In order to pursue this aim, the RCG fights to defend and develop an anti-imperialist trend within Britain, based on the long-term interests of the entire working class and oppressed internationally. The British ruling class will never allow the system which maintains its domination to be wished or voted away. It will take a revolutionary struggle led by the working class. Our organisation has existed since 1974, and we began publishing the Revolutionary Communist Journals in 1975. Since 1979, we have organised around our newspaper, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, or FRFI. In this time, we have continually engaged in crucial struggles for the working class and have developed our positions for the context of imperialist Britain, the oldest capitalist country in the world. The RCG understands that the way for human society to progress, or even to survive, is for the crisis-ridden system of capitalism to be destroyed. Whilst the resistance of the working class is spontaneously revolutionary, only through the fusion of such a struggle with Marxist thought can there be created a new communist movement capable of challenging capitalism. The only alternative to capitalism is socialism, a conscious and organised process of constructing society in which people cooperate in order to meet their needs, rather than serve the dictates of private profits. A society enabling the full development of every individual rather than privilege for a few. Today, capitalism has developed into imperialism, a system in which a small handful of nations dominate and exploit the rest of the world. This has significant impacts on the class struggle in the imperialist nations. A section of the working class, a labour aristocracy, benefits from the imperialist plunder of the rest of the world and works to prevent revolutionary change in the interests of the real masses. In Britain, this finds its political expression in the Labour Party, the official trade union movement, and their supporters across the so-called left. We recognise the importance for communists in imperialist nations to fight against this opportunism and call for a break with the Labour Party. Nations subjugated by imperialism are fighting the same enemy as we are when they launch struggles for independence. We support national liberation struggles and seek to strengthen the revolutionary wing of these struggles. Imperialism creates racism. It is the form which national oppression takes in the imperialist countries. We fight all racism and see that racism can only be fought alongside a struggle against imperialism. We support countries seeking to build socialism and defend the gains of socialist struggles through history. These are crucial lessons the RCG has learned in 5 decades of struggle in Britain. If they are learned and acted upon, then we can move forward to build a socialist movement that the working class so desperately needs in this country. What you can do in Britain is read FRFI, but also join us in building an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist movement that will place us alongside all those forces fighting imperialism and building socialism internationally. These introductory educational sessions are built around different FRFI articles, so let's move on now to the first article for this first session. This article, called Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, is 25 years old, is from issue number 182 of our paper FRFI, published in December 2004. In it, David Yaffe sums up its contribution to the struggle for socialism in Britain. The name of our newspaper itself is a political statement. It declares that fighting racism and imperialism must be at the heart of any socialist movement in imperialist Britain. It is a position that has directed the political theory and practice of the Revolutionary Communist Group for over 25 years. From our first issue, in November-December 1979, a consistent revolutionary anti-imperialist standpoint has determined the political content of FRFI. The core positions have not significantly changed, but have been expanded and made more concrete as political experience and practice has forced us to develop them. The political outcomes of struggles has often been different to what we had wanted and expected. The optimistic outcome that we fought for has frequently been set back by the opportunist forces mobilised against any militant working class or anti-imperialist movement. We have confronted such developments and learned the hard lessons from them for future struggles, as can be seen from the pages of FRFI. What are these core positions? First and foremost, at the most general level, we are Marxists and materialists. The capitalist system, by restricting production to the narrow limits of profit-making, is a crisis-ridden system. It can never satisfy the basic needs of the vast majority of humanity. Capitalism necessarily turns into imperialism, a worldwide system of brutal exploitation of the oppressed nations by a smaller number of rich, powerful, capitalist nations, with the majority of the world's population living in poverty, while a small minority squanders unprecedented wealth. As a result, capitalism creates the seeds of its own destruction. Forces from among the working class and oppressed which have an interest in overthrowing it and replacing it by socialism, a system which organises the production of wealth on a socially organised basis. Our understanding of capitalism allowed us to recognise from the beginning that globalisation was not a new stage of capitalism, but a return to those unstable features of capitalism which characterised imperialism before the First Imperialist War. There has been a frenetic international expansion of capital which has had devastating consequences for the vast majority of humanity. Far from being a beacon of unhindered capitalist development, as many left intellectuals have maintained, globalization is a sign of economic decay and increasing instability in a world of obscene and growing inequality. It has led to wars and will inevitably bring resistance and revolution. FRFI is published in the oldest imperialist country. The imperialist character of Britain has been decisive in determining British economic and political developments. Britain is still a major imperialist power, second only to the United States. The high monopoly profits that a small number of imperialist nations derive from the super exploitation of oppressed nations make it economically possible to create privileged sections of workers in imperialist countries. These workers, a labour aristocracy, constitute the social basis of opportunism. Imperialism creates a split in the working class. The upper stratum of the working class now dominates the British labour movement and ties it to imperialism, the economic foundation of its status and privileges. The labour aristocracy expresses itself politically through the Labour Party, and it controls the trade union movement. FRFI has always regarded the Labour Party as a racist, imperialist party. Alone of the main publications on the British left, FRFI called on workers not to vote Labour in the 1979 elections, and has consistently argued this position over 25 years. FRFI was able to point out what the Blair Labour government would be like before the 1997 election. 7 years of an openly racist, imperialist and warmongering Labour government have underlined the fact that no anti-imperialist or socialist movement can be built unless the British left makes a fundamental and irrevocable break with the British Labour Party. Imperialism is at the root of racism in the world today. Racism is the form national oppression takes in the imperialist country. The imperialist nations brutally exploit and impoverish the oppressed nations, then erect a barrier to keep out immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers fleeing from the resulting war and poverty. FRFI has always opposed all immigration controls, and the RCG has played a central role in many anti-racist and anti-deportation campaigns, from the Erlington Family Defence Campaign against police brutality in Islington, North London in 1980, through the 4-year-long Manchester-based anti-deportation Viraj Mendis Defence Campaign in the 1980s, to the anti-racist marches in Haringey, North London in 2001. At the time of our first issue, British imperialism faced a growing political and economic crisis. This found expression in the war in Ireland, the assault on the liberation movement in Zimbabwe, British support for the racist government in South Africa, the racist offensive against black people in this country, and attacks on working class living standards, in particular the offensive against the public sector. In all these cases, it was the oppressed masses and poorer sections of the working class who were bearing the brunt of the attack and who were fighting back and resisting. From these developments, we drew certain important political lessons, which are guiding our political practice today. Precisely because of the daily experience of their lives in Britain, of British state brutality and repression, of poverty, wages and unemployment, the oppressed sections of the working class will have few illusions about the character of the British capitalist state or imperialist governments, whether Labour, Tory or Liberal. They are therefore the key to the development of an anti-imperialist movement and socialist movement in Britain. Their struggles can begin to unify the working class against racism and imperialism and against the pro-imperialist anti-working class sections of the British Labour movement. FRFI has made this point consistently over 25 years, building a movement against the brutal occupation of Ireland throughout the 1980s in alliance with the Irish workers in Britain, demanding an end to British support for the racist apartheid state in alliance with black workers and immigrants in the 1980s, and in the attempt to build an anti-imperialist current in the anti-war movement to bring British troops out of Iraq today. The British imperialist state fears the success of a liberation movement in oppressed nations. Its economic position and political credibility in the world would be severely weakened if it could not maintain its domination over them. The resistance movements in the oppressed nations are weakening imperialism. An anti-imperialist movement in this country in unity with these struggles can deal a decisive blow against British imperialism. That is why FRFI has always given complete and unconditional support to the liberation movements fighting imperialism, and we have supported their right to defend themselves by any means necessary. We stand by our record on Ireland, on Southern Africa, on Palestine and Iraq. Through our work in solidarity with Irish prisoners, we came to support the struggles for the rights of other prisoners. Every issue of FRFI since the early 1980s has carried a Prisoners Fight Back page, and our principled work on this issue is unique on the British left. One area where our position has significantly developed was in relation to our support for the socialist countries. We had no illusions about the reactionary nature of the imperialist-backed Solidarność movement in Poland, and we understood the devastating effect that the collapse of the socialist bloc in Eastern Europe would have on the international working class movement, the oppressed nations, and the vast majority of people in the Soviet Union. FRFI argued in autumn 1990 that far from moderating imperialism's predatory character, the collapse of the socialist bloc would remove all restraints on imperialism's drive to carve up and divide the world. FRFI has consistently supported the socialist revolution in Cuba and has reported on the concrete measures that the Cuban Communist Party has taken in building and advancing socialism at home, on the leading role it has played in opposing US imperialism, and on its exemplary internationalism towards the oppressed nations impoverished by imperialism. Finally, from our first issue, we argue that the main organisations of what we called the British Petit Bourgeois left, including the Communist Party, now dissolved, Militant, dissolved, the International Marxist Group, dissolved, and the SWP, were a major obstacle to the building of an anti-imperialist movement based on the working class and oppressed in this country. In issue after issue, we showed how these organisations consistently attacked the resistance of the oppressed, whether liberation movements taking up arms to defend themselves, black youth fighting police on the streets of British cities with stones and petrol bombs, miners' hit squads dealing with scabs breaking the strike with police protection, or poll tax protesters defending themselves against police violence. Apart from the Communist Party, whose demise followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, these organisations, or their offshoots, have consistently attacked the socialist countries, including Cuba, supported Solidarność in Poland, the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and the collapse of the Soviet bloc countries. While attacking all these forces for not being socialist enough, they have refused to break with the racist, imperialist Labour Party and called for a vote for the Labour Party in general election after general election. They have one standard for the oppressed and another for themselves and their imperialist allies. Little wonder that over the last 25 years, every attempt to build an anti-imperialist movement has been thwarted by those forces. Most recently demonstrated through the devastating failure of the Stop the War movement in Britain, we have to break from the reactionary politics of these left organisations. These then are the lessons drawn from the 25 years of political campaigning around FRFI. If they are learned and acted upon, then we can move forward to build a socialist movement that the working class so desperately needs in this country. What you can do in Britain is not only read FRFI, but also join us in building an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist movement that will place us alongside all those forces fighting imperialism and building socialism internationally. For more information, like more FRFI articles, to find out about our public meetings and events around the country, or to inquire about joining, please go to our website revolutionarycommunist.org or frfi.co.uk.